Hi guys, this is Dr. Megan Marie DeLegas. I'm a physical therapist and wellness coach. I'm going to go over the fundamental movements that I look for in almost all my clients before I get into some foundational strength programs. So this first one is, you may have heard it, a cat-cow. What I call that is a cat-cow when I work with people, but it's often just called either a lumbopelvic control or thoracolumbar control or movement. So I like to call it cat-cow. It's just very commonly familiar that way. And what it looks like is basically the movement itself is movement that's happening both in the lower back to the pelvis and the upper back in the mid to lower back area. And so what we're looking for is an ability to create curvature knowingly and volitionally. So basically, you're going to create an arching or an extension through the low back and mid back. You can see that I have a pretty good amount of that anatomically. And then we create a big rounding curvature in the opposite direction. So the idea is, do we have the control and awareness to create this movement through as much range of motion as possible? Okay, some folks are very capable of doing it right off the bat. Some people need to work on the skill itself, and that's all it is. It's a skill of connecting your mind with your body and how it moves. So there are different tiers or movements or levels in which I'll work on something or the cat-cow with somebody so that it can apply to more functional movements. And I'll get to that in a second so you can see what I mean. But I'm going to go through each tier so that when you graduate one, you can move on to the next, or you can focus on one particular one when you're applying it to something else. So let's start. We're going to start with it on our back. So that cat-cow that I originally showed you was the more traditional version. Now we're working on the actual skill of the lumbopelvic control mobility and the thoracolumbar spine areas. Okay, so with it on your back, I'm just getting my hands out of the way. You can put your hands here if you want. You can put them on your side. But you're ultimately going to work on creating a really big arch all the way from your shoulder blade or mid-back area down to your tailbone. And then you're going to try to create a big rounding, same thing as we did on our hands and knees, but now we're just doing it on our back. So gaining this control is really important, and we start on our back because it simplifies the movement. It takes gravity away, it takes our limbs out of the picture, it just really simplifies the movement to here, and we're not thinking about what's going on through our legs or our arms. So you're going to practice that. And if you can create a really big arch, and it may not be as big as mine, I have a bit more of a mobile spine, but the idea is going through the full range of motion, especially when you're rounding. You almost want to imagine that your pelvis is coming up off the floor and that you're creating almost like a U shape, okay? And then you want to find your medium. So all the way to the extreme, all the way to the extreme, and then you find a happy medium for you, and that'll be your neutral. This is important because what the point of this is, we're teaching the body what neutral is. We're recognizing it in our own minds and our own body, and we're connecting the two so that when I emphasize something like get into a neutral position of your spine, you have that control and you have that knowing that you have it right. Good, so once you have it down in this one, then you progress to a different variation, which is going to be the quadruped, which is basically the cat-cow. So I'm going to show it again just so we have the sequence in order. So you're creating a really big arch even through the neck, and then a really big rounding. This is technically the cat of the cat-cow. And then you have the cow. This is technically extension and anterior tilting of the pelvis. This is more of a relative flexion and posterior tilting of the pelvis. Okay, and same thing, you would find your happy medium once you know what that is, and after you've done a few of these, you find that neutral spot. So now you're able to find neutral in a quadruped position. The next variation is going to be in a kneeling position. So now we're getting into a more upright posture, a bit more mimicking of being a human, where we are upright more than we are horizontal. So this one starts to get a little bit harder here. What you're going to try to do, I'm going to try to get my arms out of the way. You can put your arms wherever you want. Down your side is fine, but I'm just going to keep them out of the way. And so what you're trying to do is create the arch in the low back and the upper back. And then a rounding of the low back and the upper back. You'll see I don't have a lot of rounding in my low back because I tend to have a lot of arching in it. So same thing, practicing this, it's a skill. You just learn to develop the skill and it's doable. You just have to work on it daily if it's something that you struggle with. And you want to see that a lot of my head isn't really moving forward and back very much. The movement's really coming from the spine and the pelvis. So again, to emphasize, when we're arching, we're tilting our pelvis forward. That's an anterior front tilt. And then we're creating extension through the back. And then with the rounding or the cat of the cat-cow, we're creating flexion of the spine and a posterior tilt of the pelvis. So posteriorly back tilt, which is important to know these because I mention them a lot, especially when I cue people. And you just want to practice again and find your neutral. Good. Good, so that's your first upright variation. You really can, if you want to do a kind of secondary variation, is doing it while you're in a high kneel position. I usually skip this sometimes, but it's a great medium if you're struggling to do it standing, which is how we'll do it next. Okay, so same thing, you create an arch, and you create a rounding, you create an arch, and you create a rounding. You can see that when I create the rounding, I'm really getting a nice straight leg here. This is important if you have tight hip flexors. This is important with some of the strength exercises that we're going to do for glute strength. So this is a great practice here as well. So you're creating the arch, you're creating the rounding. All right, and then you want to do the same thing where you find that medium, squeeze the glutes, and you find a nice neutral spine all the way through the core. It's almost like you're doing a crunch through the front. Okay. The next one would be standing. Same thing. This is a little harder because now we have more limbs, we're a little less condensed, so we're lengthened and we are upright, and we have less surface area of our that we're utilizing for support. So less hands on the floor, less shins or knees, less on our back. So it's just going to be a bit more challenging. So the next one is here, standing. I'm getting my arms out of the way just so you guys can see. We're creating an arch and a bit of a rounding, creating an arch and a rounding, arch and rounding. And you really want to find that happy medium that's right for you, so you know where neutral is in all of them. Okay, good. So that's the last one in standing, and I'm going to give you an example of when it applies in strength training. So I'll give you two examples. One is a squat. So if we're squatting, you can be technically quite arched like this. Okay, which again, this isn't a bad thing, but if we're trying to work on specific things, and this is something that would happen with coaching, if we want to work a little bit more on abdominals, we try to posteriorly pelvic tilt back, so that would look like this. So that might look a bit more neutral than this. So this is where learning that skill is important. So then if I were to ever say, hey, I need you to be a bit more neutral or posteriorly pelvic tilt, you go from here to here. So it's the same thing, it's that skill, all right? Knowing what that looks like. And same thing with the upper back. You can create a bit more extension through the upper back or a bit more of a crunch, okay? Most of us need more extension in our upper backs. All right, so that's how we would apply in a functional movement like the squat. I'll give you another example just so you have it in a split squat. But we're gonna, instead of doing a split squat, which is when you're coming from up here, down and up, we're just gonna work on the actual movement in the split position or a half kneel position. So I could arch and then I could round, AKA anterior tilt or posterior tilt. And what we wanna do is stay in a more posterior tilt when we're working on, when we have specific goals. If we're working on getting a nice hip flexor stretch, we really want a posterior tilt. If we want to get a bit more glutes, we stay posterior tilt, but then we lean forward. There's a lot of applications, but the point of it is that if we don't know how to control that area, we're going to be targeting different muscles than what we're actually trying to work on, especially if we're doing some one-on-one coaching where we're trying to either rehabilitate an injury or pain in general, or if we're trying to build specific strength areas. So those are examples of how to use the cat-cow or anterior and posterior pelvic tilting in the thoracolumbar and pelvic region of the spine. And if you can work on the skill and really graduate yourself through all of these, then the application is going to make it so much easier when you're working on strength training. This is very foundational and it's something I work on with all my clients if they are struggling with it. It is almost like a non-negotiable, so I highly recommend practicing it, maybe 10 repetitions at least a day until you're really comfortable with it. Then you move on to the next, and you move on to the next, and then you complicate it or we make it more complex for you. All right, so if you have questions about that, shoot me a message. Happy to help you. You can always video yourself doing it and sending it to me, and I can tell you what you might need to work on next.